So I'm talking about grading through the process. And this is what I suggest you do as you're going through the process. This was what works best for me, is just to do some checks, check plus, check minus, so on. I keep it physically in a book or on my clipboard as I'm going around the room, as I'm working with students, as I'm conferring with them. And so they're getting some points every day for the process. And so if it's just a day where I'm meeting with kids and they are working on drafts and they're not turning anything in, or there's nothing big due, it may just be out of 10 points. Maybe they've got an organizer due. Maybe they have their full draft due so that I can spend some time with us. That might be 20 or 40 points. Okay, but I'm not playing around with splitting hairs with points and why did you give her a 19 and I got an 18? Or I'm just giving checks and check pluses. That's just how I think about things. And if I could keep it checks and checks pluses, I would. My college students, I keep it that way. But in the high school setting, we have to put grades in grade books in most cases. And so this is how it works out. Did this for years. I still do this with the one course I teach, and nobody complains because I just lay it out and everybody knows what's up. All right, but this is a great way of working through, of grading the process, giving students credit for the work they're doing through the process, but also allowing you to see, oh, Kristen has gotten a couple of check X's or half checks a couple days in a row here. I really need to pay attention to what she's doing tomorrow because I'm worried she's going to fall behind and maybe not get her draft done, or maybe struggle or be put in a situation where she's desperate and she decides to cheat, because most kids who cheat or plagiarize aren't jerks. They're just desperate. All right. Promise this all relates to the AP rubric and to the sophistication point, because we're going to start talking about the difference between grading and scoring here. Now, some of you all talked about this a little bit in the initial writing that you did at the beginning. And this is something that if you've been to the AP reading, that is addressed explicitly by the leadership of the reading, because we're working with a lot of people who are used to grading and we've got to get them used to scoring. Okay, but I think it's important for us who have been readers and those who haven't been readers to remember what we're supposed to be doing with our grading versus what's happening with our students' essays when they're scored. So grading is all about assessing progress, whereas scoring is about assessing performance. So yeah, you may say, okay, these students did this timed writing. I need to go and I need to score these essays. You do, but you also, that's happening during the school year. And so that should also be about progress for you. So it's not just about slapping a score on it. You're looking, and this is what you're doing. You're looking at what students are doing, what they're doing well, what they're struggling with, and you're going to develop lessons that come out of that. You're already doing these sorts of things. Okay. We just want to remember it's all about progress. It's all about growth. It's fluid. And this is why I keep saying, let them revise everything. The only problem with the revision bit is I require them to come and meet with me about it. They can't just revise it and turn it back in. They need to meet with me and get some notes. And they write the notes. I talk to them about it. They write the notes on their paper, because I don't want kids turning it in and the next day turning in another revision, next day turning in another revision. No. So when I say it's locally controlled, that's a nice way of saying it's your prerogative. It's your classroom. You know the kids. It's kind of what Guillermo was saying. He tries to remain objective with the scoring. And that's important, because if you're using that AP rubric and you're taking that AP rubric and giving kids a score on it, the students may not be able to say it this way, but the students are seeing that as internationally normed. So if you give them that sophistication point, or you give them the 4 in row B, because they've been working hard, and because that they've come really far and they've earned it, you're not doing them any favors, because now they think they've got it. And when they go to take that national test, they're going to come back to you and say, well, you were giving me this and I didn't get that. I scored lower than that. So we have to mix this idea of scoring and grading, So I encourage teachers to hold back in their classroom, to be a little bit more restrictive. And I'll show you how to get around that in a moment with some half points. And I know some of you mentioned that, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that works in the classroom. But how can you take what we learned about scoring and about the rubric and put it in your classroom to make it growth-centered and fluid and about progress? Not just saying, oh, this is who you are, you're a 4. This is who you are, you're a 3. Okay, when I know everybody on this call is about students growing and building across the school year. Okay. So a couple of questions that pop up in here from Char. Generally speaking, how many times do kids in your classes revise for the same assignment you've provided a grade? I would let them do it multiple times, but most kids would do it once. And here's the God's honest truth. Most kids who would come and meet with me voluntarily were the kids who got A- and they wanted A's, or they got B+ and they wanted A's. Sometimes there would be a kid who would get a C. If it's a timed paper, it would happen more often than not, because in the longer process papers, if they're getting a C or a D on that final paper, that's partly my fault too, because I should have monitored it more through the process. But with the timed writings, if they're not doing as well as I thought they could do, I might say, hey, okay, Janet, I'm not going to put that grade in the grade book until you come and meet with me, because I think you can do better. And I'm going to let you revise this. So that becomes the carrot that pushes them to come and meet with me. Okay. But if they come and meet with me and they submit a revised paper, I'm probably going to improve their grade. There's no probably to it. They're going to get a better grade, because I'm training them to have this growth mindset and this mindset of revision. So call it grade inflation, whatever, I don't like grades anyway. So, but I'm going to give them a better grade. Janet says, when you say assessing progress, is it on a single paper's process or in relation to ongoing papers? Janet, I think your question is about when I'm assessing progress. I'm assessing progress across the school year, how they're growing across an entire school year. So it would be within that paper, yeah, but also across a school year too. Okay, how they're learning. All right, great questions, you all. Thank you so much. I want to move on for a little bit here. So here we are to the rubric when we think about scoring and we think about grading. And this one's the language argument rubric. We'll look at the literature here in just a moment. Most of you are familiar with this. I know a lot of you talked about having on to APSIs and so on, and that's wonderful. So a little bit of background here without going too deep into the history. The reason we changed from the old 9-point rubric to this, the main reason is we wanted to be able to give more specific feedback to teachers, we being College Board. College Board was very much about, hey, we've got all this testing data, all this assessment data, and we're not giving enough back to teachers. What can we do? How can we make this work? So we had it all figured out for multiple choice. We did the course and exam description, had the skills. We tie all the multiple choice questions to the skills. We do that. But how do we do this with the rubric? No, I wasn't a big fan of the holistic rubric in the first place, the 9-point rubric. I've worked with rubrics in the Kentucky writing program for a long time. We had analytical rubrics. And the great thing about it is we could, every teacher, every 5th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade teacher in the state of Kentucky got feedback on their students saying they did really, really well with purpose, or they struggled at this point with audience, and they did well with this point of evidence, and they struggled with this point as far as development and commentary goes. And that was really valuable. And so many schools across the state saw their writing programs grow significantly because of that. Well, and there were other states doing similar things too. So we knew we wanted to do something like that where we could give more specific feedback. We tried so many things. We tried taking the original holistic rubric and making it a checklist. We tried different levels of canned commentary that readers, AP readers could give when they did this. It's just nothing was consistent and made sense. So we went through different iterations of the rubric, and this is the one we came up with. Originally, there were row B and row C. Row B was evidence and row C was commentary, but we realized we couldn't separate the two. We also had an extra point for thesis up here, but we realized that if you got the higher point in thesis, you were getting the higher points in row B and C. So that really wasn't the difference. That's why there's only 1 point for thesis. And we can, if you want to have a longer conversation about this really nerdy math conversation, I'm happy to do it. Reach out to me. But when we look at the rubric, the goal is to always start at point 3 in row B. So, I mean, they get the thesis or they don't. It's low hanging.